So, first of all, hi everybody. Thanks for having me again. My name is Tihomir. I am well. When I presented first time, it was just when I started with Temporal. I think a couple of months into, I was a developer advocate. I moved more to kind of like a developer success role, meaning basically I provide support for both open source, Temporal open source, and a community, as well as some customer questions and stuff like that. I've been around workflows for a while. I've been around, I started off over, I don't know, 10, 12 years ago with BPMN. And if you guys ever need a presentation on that, let me know. But, so after that, I kind of started doing more DSL or domain specific language types of workflows, which is I'm a project lead of the serverless CNCF serverless workflow project, which we'll kind of talk about today. So I went from kind of flowchart based visualization of writing your business processes to more JSON YAML type of thing to define the same. And now, of course, the temporal focuses on using programming languages to define your workflow definition. So I kind of have one thing, I've kind of seen it all, and I think maybe this will be interesting. And I don't really have any slides. We'll just go off the website and some of the GitHub URLs, if that's okay. And it's let's do this more low key. Feel free to interrupt me at any time, ask any questions. If I'm going too fast or if you think I missed something, just speak up and let me know, and let's have some fun. So in this specific presentation, we're going to talk about defining, serverless workflow project, and also these things called DSLs. And the DSL is domain-specific language. It is a way that's kind of been popular for a number of years now. It really has been started with this AWS step functions and followed by Google Cloud Workflow. And now it seems everybody wants a DSL. DSL is typically, represented in some markups, and that whether it be JSON or YAML. And it's very easy to create. So creating a DSL on top of, for example, your existing workflow runtime engine or some that you want to adopt is typically not that hard. And a lot of companies are doing it. We will talk about some of the most common use cases for DSL. So if it's easy, if it's not very complex to define some sort of JSON or YAML structure, back it up with some JSON schemas for validation. So why should we even create a project around it? Well, similarly to what happened with BPMN and kind of workflow technologies in general, they're often driven, even though they're kind of quote unquote based on standards, they're often driven by a set number of companies. And once you get into these types of workflow technologies, they use these things like higher level type of markups, such as BPMN or DSL or things like that. Oftentimes, than not, you unfortunately run into some sort of vendor locks. Then a lot of companies say, okay, well, then I will create my own DSL, which a lot of people are do, and that's also very, very valid type of thing. And then they have to create parsers, they have to create visualization, they have to create some sort of typically mapping between their DSL and the underlying workflow runtime that actually does the workflow execution. No matter what type of workflows you use or not, the actual execution is going to be done by code. So these types of higher level abstractions to define your business processes or workflows, or whatever you call them, is always actually executed by some code that actually runs. So it's a lot more stuff than just writing some sort of JSON and YAML and executing that typically happens. And there isn't currently a project, well, except I will show serverless workflow, that is fully open source. And not only is it open source, but it's completely vendor neutral. So one of the things about this project, and it's even atypical in my opinion, even within CNCF or kind of open source, is we're not backed by any company. So this is full community effort from people, and we have a fairly small group community, and hopefully you guys will join it if you wish, of kind of workflow enthusiasts that just come in and contribute on their own time, own effort. So we're, for example, a lot of even open source projects as you're right now are typically backed by some company, and the people working on it are getting paid for it. None of us are getting paid for this. And that's kind of one unique about this, that I think it's actually allowed us to grow in a way that has been kind of very exciting over, especially this and last year. So just kind of to understand, serverless workflow is not just giving you a DSL, which we will talk about. It gives you a whole type of environment with different things. And also it gives you a community support that you get for free. And it's Apache 2 license. So everything that you do is going to be free. You can use it at your own company. Of course, Apache 2 license, some things with has some restrictions. For example, if you take some code, you should probably put the license headers wherever in your project and blah, blah, blah. But that's regardless of this presentation. So kind of give you an overview of serverless workflow. We do provide a specification, which is a DSL backed by JSON schemas. So the entire DSL language, every single thing that you can do to describe your business processes using JSON or YAML in this case is backed up by a schema. So you can validate everything depending on, of course, the version that's released. We do have a community, and one of the things as far as the community goes, or what other things we provide, are these things called SDKs. We have SDKs in different languages. You'll see here Java, Go, TypeScript, .NET, and we recently added Python as well. And what these SDKs do, they're not actually runtimes. These SDKs do provide, for example, parsing from JSON YAML to object model back to the actual DSL. They provide things like validation. They provide things like diagram generation and stuff like that. So if you want to start adopting our DSL, not only do you get the JSON and YAML definitions, but you also get some sort of tooling around it that you can use out of the box. In addition to that, we have these things, for example, like this thing called a web editor that uses some open source stuff, like, for example, the VS Code type of editor, JSON, to actually write your JSON and YAML. And also, as you can see, has a built-in validation. So you get that out of the box. From our TypeScript SDK, you get visualization of these things. And I'll try to find one. So you get that out of the box. So we really try to provide not only some sort of what we think and what I know is probably the best, most expressive DSL out there. By far, it's a superset of things like Google Cloud Workflow and AWS Step Functions right now. But also you get some sort of tooling that you can use out of the box and go with it. On top of that, we do host some workflow runtime, and we will actually show a demo later on of one of them. So within our project, we're open to runtimes coming in and wanting to be part of the project in CNCF. So currently we have one workflow runtime called Synapse, which I will demo later a little bit. But we're working with some other big companies that actually want to contribute their workflow runtime that supports our DSL specification and make it part of our project and free and Apache 2 license for everybody to use. So why really the DSL? Number one, as I said, it's kind of more like a vendor lock type of thing. But on top of that, if you start using a DSL, let's say you don't want to define your own and go with somebody else that's already existing, typically you'll find that the integration of that of what you can express with a DSL really comes very closely tied with the actual provider or the cloud provider. So for example, it just is natural that, for example, Google Cloud Workflow allows you to interact very easily with their own services, but not, for example, other things. Same thing with, AWS. They make it super easy to start interacting with different AWS services, and they also provide integration out of the box for them. But as soon as you want to integrate with some services or microservices that are not part of that ecosystem, you're going to run into some issues. So what we did with serverless workflow, we said, look, we're not going to define some executions, for example, invocations of functions, consuming events, different things. We're not going to do anything proprietary. So we actually decided to go fully standards-based. So what kind of drove us to that is we actually were initially part of the CNCF serverless working group. and this is the website. And now we have our own GitHub, but as you can see, we used to be part, or the project itself was born from the CNCF Serverless Working Group. And this is the same working group that actually created the cloud event specification. And I think you guys, probably everybody's familiar with that now. So out of the bat, that type of tight integration with cloud events, as you will see, all the events that you can, for example, input events and also output events that you can use to start workflow executions, to continue workflow executions, to correlate with other different events, as also events that you, during workflow execution, can publish out of two other services. For example, Async Api, event-driven architectures have to conform to the cloud events format. And for things like function execution, so invoking third-party microservice, it doesn't have to be a microservice. Everybody uses the word. But in general, invoking some sort of third-party thing, whether that it's another workflow or another service along the line, is done also with things like Open API for async type of things, event-driven applications. Async API for the Open API for the REST type of services. We do have support for GraphQL, gRPC, and things like that. So the idea behind the project is really three things. You define your workflow definitions using some sort of abstraction in JSON and YAML. You develop your applications using one of our provided SDKs in different languages, and you can execute it on different workflow runtimes, that being cloud native or distributed runtimes, like we'll see, for example, with Temporal and things like that. All right. Any questions so far? Been going fast. Just to show from our website, our GitHub repository, as far as CNCF goes, we are actually in the CNCF landscape, and we're a tiny little dot right here, if you see my mouse, in the app definition and development category. So we are this project was born out of CNCF, and this is another unique thing that I maybe could mention, is a lot of projects are donated to CNCF. Our project is one of the few that actually came from CNCF. So about 3 years ago, I started kind of this project working with the Cloud Events team, and have been kind of doing this for a while. Anyways, that's a little background if it matters. On our website also, one of the things that I wanted to kind of say is the DSL itself, again, is not, creating a DSL is not hard. And I don't want you guys to think that if you want to, for example, have a DSL, you have to use this or you have to use something existing. You can always create your own. One thing about serverless workflow, though, we really try to kind of out of the box allow you to express a lot of different things that business processes need. So, for example, one of the things is reacting to events. And if you, for example, take an existing kind of highly used DSL out there by these big companies, you don't get this. Basically, you have to define your workflow definitions to do X, Y, Z, either parallel or sequential. But the event handling, you probably have to deal with in another system from their cloud provider. With serverless workflow, you do have event definitions. For example, we'll take a look at that. You have these event refs. Everything is domain specific, meaning from the name of your workflow state, or what we call what's in BPMN, for example, called a task or a step in step functions and stuff like that. We call this workflow states. And everything is domain specific, from naming events. So, for example, we say here on high body temperature event and high blood pressure event, we want to execute some actions. And again, our function invocations are, again, domain specific. So we just say invoke dispatch nurse function. So there is nothing proprietary there, and we will see how we actually define these specifics of these function invocations and event definitions and things like that. We do have full support for sync and async invocations of different things. For example, a function could be a REST invocation. A function could be a sending of an event. A function could be an execution of some sort of script or things like that. So there's many different things that this can be. And you can actually easily define to invoke it synchronous, meaning you wait for the results of this function to complete before you continue, or async, meaning you just fire and forget, and you can, for example, wait for the results of this invocation later on. One of the things that's with DSLs that's always a problem is expression languages. In programming languages, you have the programming language support, right? Do things like define data structures and manipulate them in many different ways. With DSLs being in JSON and YAML, most of them do rely on some sort of expression languages. And again, given different DSLs, you're always going to run into probably some proprietary expression language that you have to learn and that you cannot really easily port to a different runtime if you decide so. With serverless workflow, we decided to use JQ, but as the default expression language, so it's very powerful. I mean, JQ is, you guys that I mean, you can do all kinds of stuff with it. But you can actually plug in your own expression language here too, and you can say, define it and allow your runtime to know exactly which expression language you're using when it's parsing out your expressions and evaluating them as well. Standard things like, for example, handling failures. There is different failures now. Even the failures themselves are domain specific, so we do reference this everywhere. For example, we have some sort of missing order ID for this particular function invocation. Then we can either transition, we can end workflow, we can start compensation. You can do a whole bunch of different things once you handle the particular error. We do define things like compensation. These are typically, BPMN has it too, and usually you don't get compensation in a DSL. But again, we have it available. For example, we can say that a workflow state is compensated by another workflow state here. And on this some particular error, for example, we want to start compensation here, which means we want to end workflow, workflow execution. But before we end it, we want to trigger compensation of each of these particular states they define compensation in reverse order or in parallel or whichever way you want to do it in the end. Starting workflows is always important. You can start workflow executions with some sort of input parameters such as JSON data. And one thing it's interesting, the workflow definition is JSON and YAML. The workflow data with DSLs is almost always, it is JSON, right? So that's why we kind of need an expression language like JQ to actually be able to manipulate the workflow data during workflow execution. Starting workflows can take some sort of initial JSON as data input, but you can also start workflows on some sort of schedule. For example, define that you want to start your workflow execution via cron. A serverless workflow also has some sort of periodic execution. You can define times in between. So for example, if you want your workflow just to be active during working hours, you can define a period of time here as well. Or you can start, as you'll see, also workflow executions, which are triggered by events that come in, such as, some sort of patient vitals come in and things like that. So we do provide. So what I'm trying to say is basically everything is within DSL. There is nothing actually that you have to define outside of your DSL. Now, there is some other things that I wanted to show. For example, we do have comparisons. So one important thing that if you're coming to serverless workflow and you want to kind of learn, or you come from a different DSL, you just want to compare, hey, is this thing for me or not? Or should I be using it? We have some comparisons, for example, to Argo, to BPMN, to things like Brigade, Google Cloud Workflow. We're actually adding right now for AWS as well, working on that. And we do actually have a comparison to Temporal, but as we'll see in the demo, Temporal and serverless workflow actually fit very nice together for many different things. So anyways, if you want to get started with that, we do have a roadmap that we're updating, and I'll talk about it later. We do have a bunch of use cases also defined here. And of course, we have tons of examples. So if you're like, usually when new users come in, they go to the examples, check, and see if, if this is something for them. And all of them we define with both JSON and YAML, and kind of some sort of visualization here as well. The main document for the specification is the specification document. We are in dire need of some technical writers here because, it's just, we are all kind of developer types or things like that doing this within the community. But it is basically, we really try to define every single thing about the specification. We do define for every single concept. There is a picture typically, sorry, I'm scrolling down just to show this table. So you see all the different parameters for different things followed by specific example. So if you're going through this document, which is fairly large, you kind of get the idea of what the DSL can and cannot do for you. So let's see what else we got. So as far as our workflow community, I wanted to show just the community page here, if you guys don't mind. We do have project maintainers. We have currently 5. Each one is from a different company. So even on this perspective, this project, again, is completely vendor neutral, completely not funded by anything. It is part of CNCF, but we do not get any funding from anybody. And we also have some core active contributors, and that we're updating this list as we go. As far as what else did I not cover? All right, we do have things like workshops, and we put them on this website. Typically once a month, we have workshops, and what we do in these workshops is we have guest speakers come in, typically from projects they are using the serverless workflow DSL and maybe some of our SDKs, and just give them, and if you join here, you can kind of get an idea of how people are using it. We had one actually today. We had Thierry give a great presentation on Fastnet and kind of event mesh integration that he's currently working on. And we all, next week, I think we're looking for a speaker for next month, but let's see. As far as adoption goes, there are companies actually, this list is bigger. I mean, one thing for open source projects is really hard to kind of figure out who's using you. Most of the people won't even tell you. If they do tell you, it's kind of, tug and pull to actually allow to ask them to put their logo on here. But we do have a number of both type of companies and as well as open source projects. They have openly said they're using the DSL and supporting it. For example, Apache Event Mesh is one of the new ones. Fastnet I just talked about, and things like that. They are kind of openly saying, yes, we are using and we are planning to use it. And there's every week we get somebody, but again, updating this list is hard. So anyways, any questions so far, or should we? No, okay, I can then continue.
Can you hear us?
Yes.
You had temporal on there as a user. Is temporal going to support this syntax like as a runtime?
No, that's a good question. Temporal actually is a runtime that can support any DSL. So one of the things that, because I'm kind of like working there, we do support, we do provide samples, especially in Java. Our samples do provide integration with temporal and serverless workflow. If you go to our Java samples, for example, Go samples don't have that, and they have kind of typical DSL. But the idea with temporal is that you can run pretty much any DSL on top, and serverless workflow is one of them that we're, there is work around the community work currently to actually provide an open source full integration. And the demo that we actually show kind of uses that as well today. So yeah. So these are just companies that either support as far as fully adopt or just have shown support for a project, as far as, of course, me being able to work on it and others as well for different companies. Doesn't necessarily mean, but we do have, for example, Red Hat has a project, and Roglia, we will show that. and other companies do have actual products that they're using us in. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Cool. All right. And as far as also, we're always part of KubeCon, being part of CNCF. We do have project office hours. We do sometimes talk at KubeCons as well. So, that's kind of like our outlet for where we actually get most of the community support. The community exposure is basically KubeCon. And of course, awesome meetups like yours here. So thank you for the opportunity. So anyway, so what I'm going to stop talking. I'm just going to do a couple of demos, if that's okay. And then we'll see where we go. The first thing I wanted to show off is kind of this integration with Temporal. And for this,
you may need to zoom in at least once or twice on that screen.
yeah, and we won't be looking at much code. So this is just.
Can you see that okay?
Oh yeah, let's
Turn the lights on.
Yeah, well, it's hard to see on the projector. 'cause
That'd be
it's
great.
bigger. You should do your presentation.
Thanks, Brian.
So just to kind of give an introduction for people that haven't seen the last. Oh, okay. All right, let's go ahead and. So what I wanted to talk about first, as far as demos goes, is talk about Temporal, and just to understand. So typically, most use cases about using DSL is when you have, for example, expose your DSL to your end users. If you're actually working in-house and you want to write your workflows, the most natural and probably best thing is to use a programming language. There is really, it really depends, but some companies, for example, that want to expose some sort of visualizations, or they want to, have some sort of user input or user defining the steps of execution. This is the typical use cases where you want to kind of have a DSL. So again, if your company, you're thinking about using workflows, you're thinking about using fault-tolerant distributed runtimes and things like that, probably there is absolutely no need to go higher level and use a DSL, because in the end, they are going to be more restrictive than programming languages. They are going to have a smaller community. They're hard to debug in the end, and typically require some sort of specific needs, where programming languages for workflows do not suffer from these things. For example, just if you're using, for example, Java, you have a huge ecosystem. You have a number of editors that you can use out of the box. You can debug your code, basically with your debugger system. So it really depends on your situations. But in the case for this, a lot of people are using DSL. And this is kind of, the same type of thing, but inside a Quarkus app. So this could be also done with Spring Boot. This integration demo that I will show is basically integration with the serverless workflow DSL, the serverless workflow Java SDK, and the Temporal SDK. And of course, Temporal running as the execution environment, distributed runtime for this particular workflow execution. And to show this, we basically have a simple workflow, and I've tried to zoom in, see if this works. Is this better? I hope it is. And just to kind of go over it, we even with DSL, we can define things like timeouts, like for example, a timeout of a workflow execution. We can define different timeouts of different actions. So you can define, okay, if my particular function microservice invocation takes more than 10 seconds, then raise an error or handle the error and handle the error appropriately. Another thing is, for example, also retries. You can define things like workflow retries. You can define retries on the functional level. So this type of stuff you can also define within the serverless workflow DSL. But anyways, in this case, we have an application called New Customer Application. It is triggered by an event called New Application Event. This event is defined actually right here. So we do use the cloud event specification. So our new application event has a type. In this case, it is a Java type, but it could be any type that you specify in your cloud events format. And it has a source. Now, this source can be many things. This event can come from Kafka, MQTT, can come from a WebSocket, whatever you want to define. But basically, it is basically a source where our runtime needs to actually be able to get the event and then start the workflow execution with this particular type from this source. Now, what this demo doesn't show is you can actually also define correlations as well. So I think here, if I came here, I can define a one or many correlations. And these correlations are again done on these cloud events context attributes. So, you know, it's not done actually on the payload, but on the context. So you can actually correlate multiple events on things like, for example, applicant ID and things like that, if you wanted as well. Now, this correlation, of course, as far as how you implement it in your runtime, you know, that's again up to you, but you can define within your DSL a correlation between events as well. And basically, once we receive this event, new application event, we have a number of actions or function executions and things like that. And you can even decide whether you want to invoke them sequentially or in parallel in this case, which, you know, for this demo, we're going to do that. And each action, again, has a unique name. It's a domain-specific name. In case we want to invoke check customer info function. And our function definition here is is the function ref check customer info. And check customer info is a function definition, which is just of type REST in this case. Now, these things can be many different types. It can be async API definition. It can be an expression, a GraphQL definition, OData, REST, like in this case, and RPC. And just for the sake of the demo, since we're just using localhost, I don't have to define what's called an operation. But here, for example, you could use, like ARN, like, for example, AWS or HTTP endpoint and blah, blah, blah as well. But this is just a simple demo right now, and that's that. So the idea is that once we receive an event, we want to perform a couple of functions. Once we have received the results of the function, we want to actually evaluate the data using an expression language, or in this case, a condition. So we're basically saying if the age of the applicant is greater or equal 20 years old, we want to transition to the state called here approve application. And if it's less, we want to, basically we're making a switch statement or the decision based on data. So it's an if else statement. But again, with serverless workflow, you can have data conditions, but you can also have event on events, I think it's called. Oh, this is a data condition. Well, I'll show, but basically you can you can, depending on which event you receive, you can make event-based decisions as well with the DSL. And that's it. So on the right-hand side, you can see the visualization of that, which is using the TypeScript SDK of the Serverless Workflow project, and you get that for free as well. And you can basically visualize your diagrams as well. As you can see here, that's the same thing. Whoops, sorry. As the web editor that you get from our website, and you have a bunch of different examples here to actually see that it's dynamically generated from your thing. So, okay, so visualizing some sort of DSL is great, but typically what you want to do in your applications is create some sort of inputs for your users. So this could be like a website that you have, some sort of form input that you have, and you allow users to enter some information, press a button. They don't really know what's going on, but in the background, this actually sends a request to our endpoint of our application in cloud events format. This is going to become the payload of our event, and this particular event is going to be of new customer application, which is going to trigger the actual invocation of our workflow. And just to go to kind of like look at some code finally, the actual implementation of the actual this is JSON, right? Our workflow definition is in JSON. It has a number of instructions. And to actually look at some code, this is actually the actual Java code that uses the temporal Java SDK to actually implement the serverless workflow specification. And these states, for example, event state, switch state, and things like operation state and things like that. So in here, basically, this is going to be a library that is open source and for you free to use. But we use some features of temporal that are really great. For example, with Java, we have a thing called a dynamic workflow, which is basically allows you to give any sort of DSL, JSON, or YAML to it, and it's going to be able to handle it. So temporal out of the box is really good support for things like feeding it some sort of DSL instructions and parsing it, and actually then using, for example, things like temporal API to interact with the temporal server to actually start executions and run the workflows. So with this integration between, for example, a DSL, whether or not you use serverless workflow or not, that's up to you. But as far as temporal goes, with a DSL, you automatically get things like fault tolerance, you get things like distributed invocations. So one thing that I don't think any runtime out there you can do with, you can, for example, run your make application decision state on one set of servers, or set of let's say clusters or pods, and then you can decide to run a different state or workflow state on a completely separate one. So this type of distributed system, which temporal gives you out of the box, you can actually have also with your DSL executions. But long story short is this is kind of like what you have to do. So it seems like a lot of code, but more or less it is basically just parsing the JSON and converting the instructions of this particular JSON into actual execute API information that you using the temporal Java SDK to actually run your workflow, also just programming language itself. So anyway, so let's just kind of give it a name. So I put my name in there. Let's say I'm 40 and I want to, let's say, buy a laptop. And once I run this workflow, this is actually going to a REST endpoint of our application. And I don't know where that is. I haven't looked. So basically, I think here, we're going to post our JSON to a REST endpoint, whether here it's Quarkus, it could be Spring Boot or whatever. This is actually going to just use the temporal API to create a workflow instance, and it's going to give it the workflow DSL as input over workflow. And then the actual execution is, again, going to be done here, meaning that temporal, our code, or actual workflow code written in this case in Java using the temporal Java SDK, is going to parse this JSON instructions and actually run all the steps the way they are defined in our workflow. So let's see what happens here. So basically, in our input, we can also say application is approved, and this is because I've entered, I am older than 20 years old. And at the same time, we can see workflow results that are also in JSON, and we can also see them, I think, here as well, much better. And this is our input that we provided. And after workflow execution, this particular demo shows all the different actions, what they're called here. In temporal, they're called activities. So we can see that first we performed a check customer info action, which should have been done here. So this could be a service invocation or whatever you want it to be. Then we did called an action called update application info, which got invoked. And at the end, we approved the application in our switch state based on our data condition of the results of those two things. So hopefully this was, just a small demo to show you that it's pretty easy. This is kind of like more or less a typical DSL type of thing that a lot of, cloud providers are kind of providing to users. Of course, you have to pay for it. But if you want to kind of have similar something like this for your applications, you can get it for free, if you wanted to. Any questions so far? Oh, yeah, and I just wanted to show you, actually, in the temporal UI, that here we have a serverless workflow, and I have a lot more, just working throughout the day. And in the temporal web UI, you can also see that we have a completed workflow execution. We see the input that we provided. For example, this is by a laptop and my information here. We can see the results as well. And with temporal also, what you get for free is a full execution history of every single event that happens. So for example, the client requested the workflow execution to start. We have sent a signal, which is actually our event when we pressed the button here. Sorry, where am I here? Yeah. And then we can see all the different activities or actions that were actually executed during workflow execution. And in the end, we can actually see the workflow completed successfully. It can also fail. And here are the results that we also see in JSON here as well. Okay, I got one more quick demo, if that's okay, to go through. Now, the integration with temporal is great, but there's many different companies actually integrating DSLs with different runtimes. And to show a little bit about our project, we do have, so let me go to the GitHub page again. We do have one of the runtimes called Synapse, which has been contributed by a company called Neuroglia. Now, important thing here is there are others coming in here, but this is also part of the serverless workflow project, is Apache 2 license. And it has to adhere to all the code of conducts and the maintainer guidelines by both CNCF and our serverless workflow project. So this is not something that will go away or is in any sort of shape or form proprietary, but there are maintainers or contributors that are contributed for this and doing this basically for free. But Synapse in this case is a community-driven workflow management system that does support the specification. It can run both on Docker and Kubernetes. And it's actually pretty great. And I wanted to show you that. Let's see if I have it actually running. So just to kind of get you the idea, if you wanted to go ahead and play out of the box and you don't want to have some sort of integrations and things like that, this is really easy to get up and running. You can just basically run some wget command, for example, on Mac OS X, and either start it in native mode or run this particular Docker command to start it. It'll start in a couple of seconds. Kubernetes support this from what the maintainers told me, coming out in the next version, next release, which will hopefully come out soon. So that will be also available. Right now, I'm running this on Docker as well. But basically, it has a little bit of a visual way of defining your workflows. So here I can create a workflow definition. And again, this has the same type of auto-completion features as, for example, we show in the web editor and the demo. And what I'm going to do just real quick is just grab one workflow definition so I don't have to paste it. So I'm going to go to a web editor and just grab this hello world, I think, because just to make sure that, this Synapse being fairly new, I don't know what's yet working or not. So let's say I create a hello world DSL definition, which basically just has an inject state. An inject state is a workflow state that puts some sort of data into the workflow data and then returns it as a result. And that's all this workflow does. So I'm going to create this workflow, and it's going to show me in the info a little bit visualization of this particular workflow. Now, there is different things you can do, and there's some error messages basically, but it is executable, but it is fairly new. And given this information, you get much better visualization than some of what we have currently in our SDKs. But you can actually run an instance of this workflow. And I think, you can say, for example, we can give it some new input data. You can say title, for example, is Mr. And we can start our workflow execution. This is actually going to create a new pod, and hopefully this runs on my machine. If it doesn't, I apologize. There's these guys that actually write this know much better what they're doing than me. But okay, here we go. Finally, it's starting. each execution in this particular workflow runtime does create a new container in a Docker container. So each workflow execution is going to be executed in its own Docker container. And once we click it, we can see, for example, the information. We can see the input. We can see the output. So basically, all the workflow definition did is add the hello world result JSON to our workflow input. We can see things like the time created, started, executed, and the duration of the execution of this particular workflow. So just to, this is part of the Serverless workflow project. It is hopefully one or many future runtimes that will be part of our project, but just to kind of show you that you can get started and run these little DSL workflows pretty much in minutes, I think, or whatever it takes to do that, to install it, basically. All right, so I think this is it for my present. This is all I had. You guys have any questions or not?
Do you have any other runtimes that have expressed interest? I know there's like Argo workflows is in the CNCF. Like, have they expressed interest in supporting this spec?
Yeah, we're closely working with Argo. We haven't really. They have their own DSL, which is, I think, very valid. They have Argo workflows. They also have Argo events. As far as sub projects that I do, we are working to them. The projects that we're really closest working to right now is actually Async API. And if you look on YouTube, we have presented at their Async API Conf, and I think that's one of the projects. One of the things to look into that we're trying to accomplish right now is actually convert the JSON definition of a workflow definition into an Async API definition. So you can basically take your workflow definition and convert it into an Async API and basically generate your event-driven services code out of it easily. So that's one of the things we're currently working right now. We're also working with Event Mesh, Apache Event Mesh right now. But with Argo, it's kind of here and there. I think they are very driven. They have a huge community, much bigger than what we have. And they're also, kind of backed, I think, into it, right? I can remember. And so it's a little bit harder to get them to kind of dedicate people to actually do this. They're more relying on us to do it, and we're kind of weekend warriors here for this project, and so it hasn't happened yet, basically.
So you haven't convinced GitHub to switch GitHub Actions over to this spec yet?
No, we haven't been able to. Yeah, there are actually some big companies. Actually, I'm not going to name them, but you could maybe figure it out. They're dropping BPMN for DSLs, and it doesn't have to be, again, serverless workflow, but this kind of use case of having some sort of abstraction from code in case of visualizations or allowing end users, or if you have a team that's non-technical, for example, the kind of low code, no code type of thing. So DSLs are out there. They are important. They are being used all over the place. Again, if you do have technical people on your staff, using programming language, I'll be the first one to tell you is the best way to go and most expressive and overall just there, and you should use it. But there are use cases for DSL, and in this case, I think this is a good open source free project that you can adopt and try it out, and just be part of the community. Say hi. That would be also great. Thank you.
So that's where you see most people adopting right now is they just take the spec and they're going to build their own anyway. Might as well use your spec. And then they build their own runtime.
We have seen companies do that. We've seen companies even found one today that, for example, took Temporal, open source, took serverless workflow DSL and just did their own thing with it, created their own UIs. There are companies actually that did the whole visualization part using serverless workflow. So they just took that little, mermaid JS diagrams that I showed you, put it in a VS Code extension, and they're running off and telling their users they have some sort of similar experiences, for example, AWS has with step functions. And this is the type of thing that we're trying to do. Is we're not trying to replace anything or anybody. We're just trying to show that there is a way for workflows to be truly open source. Because even with BPMN, and I don't know how many of you guys have been around it for a while, the first thing people will tell you, it is based on a specification, but the reality is that's just as much farce as anything else, because as soon as you step into any sort of workflow, flowchart based thing, you're bound by proprietary editors, you're bound by proprietary runtimes, things like that. So what we're here for is just say, hey, look, we're open source, we're free, you do whatever you want with it, but we're here. And I think that's kind of has to happen at some point. And I hope that we can be that, but future will tell. I don't know. We'll see.
Awesome. Do you know any projects that are actually using like code generation from the DSL?
Yeah, one thing will be hopefully with Async API, because if we can convert our DSL to the JSON YAML of Async API, they have code generations in many different languages. So you should be able, and I think Fastnet actually that I showed on our website is doing that as well. They are taking the DSL and converting it into, but it should be part of open source. So hopefully they will also contribute it to like Open API, Async API, and their tooling, and hopefully that will become part of some open source projects. But yeah, if it's some one-off on GitHub, I don't think we want to, we will use it, but I don't think it's kind of part of the whole picture, I think. Not sure. Yeah.
So in the Kubernetes operator space, wasn't there a declarative operator? You remember that
Oh
one?
yeah, meta controller.
The meta controller. Some of these things you kind of think would be interesting to, I don't know, you could do some interesting stuff with this. I don't know if they're actually using this DSL or not, but it'd be interesting if they would, because then, yeah, okay.
Theoretically, you could write an operator that took the DSL like workflow configuration as a CRD type, right? And then processed it internally, and yeah, you're right.
Your stuff that way. So that'd be an interesting add-on.
And use a way to like configure your operator behavior without having it be in the operator code.
Yeah.
Not a bad idea. I mean, yeah, every time we say DSL, I think like CRDs basically are all each their own little DSL.
Yeah,
Like
they are.
that's what a CRD is. It's its own little like,
But instead of having,
here's
operators.
data, here's how it should behave,
Just call it an API spec.
I mean, yeah,
DSL.
but depends on how fancy you get. Like some of them aren't. Anyway,
Do you have any,
you're right, it is API.
anybody who's doing like more of a dynamic on the fly kind of redefining the DSL? I don't know if that makes sense. So based on certain conditions, maybe actually redefining or actually rewriting some of the DSL.
Rewriting as in, okay. I mean,
If you look at the ML world, you could actually do some interesting things by, on the fly, determining different things that you'd want to do in your DSL that you wouldn't know unless it's during the runtime.
yeah, the way, like, it's kind of also similar with, whether you use DSL or not. The dynamic part is usually you have some sort of static input to your workflow execution, and the dynamic part is things like events or what the protocol, for example, signals and things like that. So you can, during execution, provide some more information, and that's also expressed. It can be expressed also via the DSL and, of course, programming model as well, and to kind of, add more data or manipulate the execution given some external events that happen, for example. I don't know if that's what you mean. Sorry if I didn't answer your question.
No. Other questions or comments?
Give him a round of applause, huh?
Yeah.
Thank you very much, everybody, and thanks for having me. And you guys are a great group, and always so nice, to come here and talk to you.
Jimmy, we appreciate you doing it again, and again, hope to see you again.
Yeah, just keep in touch, and yeah, you guys are awesome. Thank you.
I will. Take care.
Bye.